Well, hello everybody. Jumping back in um, to Hinlicky's book on Lutheran theology, A Critical Introduction. Um, we already covered the book's introduction, but now we're jumping into the particular chapters. Now, I said last time, I don't know how many chapters there are. There's four chapters. And basically, as well, unless we count the conclusion, which we might do, right? So maybe five episodes or six episodes. Basically, just as in the introduction, how Hinlicky is talking about how Lutheranism is this tradition in progress, talking about how all of those changes took place in conflict and how the continued changes are part of carrying that conflict forward, which brings those changes out. Each of those chapters then deals with a particular epoch or a particular era in that progress. So the first chapter here, this is chapter one, unless we count the introduction, right? This is about Luther himself, Luther's reforms, Luther's transition within himself. Chapter two, confessionalism to orthodoxy. And I believe, if I recall correctly, there's some stuff about pietism. Chapter three is on the idealistic theology of liberal Lutheranism, and four is on neo-orthodoxy and the renewal of Trinitarianism. So that's the way that this movement looks within that book. And within the first chapter, just to give you a little bit of an overview as to what we're going to be talking about today, he goes all the way from not where I would start personally. I would probably start, if we're talking about change within Luther, from him trying to be a lawyer, obviously, in my opinion, right? Or even his childhood. Like, just do the full-on Luther biography and then move toward um, this kind of, if you can, um, work in early Luther's life, where he is working within the confines of Roman Catholic medieval theology to his realization that that's not actually what he's finding in Scripture, in the book of Romans, in the book of the Psalms, in Hebrews, and so on. So where Hinlicky starts, though, is with the 95 Theses. So all of those things I mentioned, Luther's childhood, Luther's upbringing, Luther trying to be a lawyer, Luther, becoming a monk and living in this medieval Roman, um, theological framework takes place before the 95 Theses, but where Hinlicky begins is with that 95 Theses. However, he begins already with it presupposed and presumed. So he says here just a little bit of a quote, and I don't want to quote too much from the book because it's newer and it's copyrighted and so on. But um, he says, I'll just paraphrase it. This moment in the writing of the 95 Theses, the posting of the 95 Theses, is just the beginning, right? It was not the end. However, and this is an important piece, and I've spoken about Luther, the Reformation, online at Transcendent Truth. I've spoken about it publicly in presentations that I've given in the city of Cornwall and online on other people's channels, and I've written about it extensively as well. And one thing that you always have to note, because a lot of people don't know this, is Luther did not think that the posting of the 95 Theses was going to do anything as radical as it did accomplish, right? He didn't think that it was going to spark what we now call the Reformation. He didn't think it was going to cause any kind of a church split or a schism. He didn't think he was going to get in trouble for it. He thought the Pope was on his side, right? And this is why I say it might actually be important for the cohesion of this idea to connect that with the earlier concept of him, not concept, but the earlier context of him wrestling with these ideas from within the confines of that medieval Roman Catholic theology. See, because when he's doing so, he's assuming that all of that stuff is correct. That, of course, the Pope's not going to lead him astray. The Pope's not going to do anything bad. And if anything is happening for ill within the Roman Catholic Church in that age, it has to be something that's happening accidentally, not on purpose, because the Pope would never try to do something like that, right? Now, when he gets into the writing of the stuff, a lot of it's not Lutheran. And I've said this before. We did two episodes, I think it was at least two or three on the 95 Theses, and there it was noted, like, this is not a Lutheran document. A lot of this stuff is still going to be affirmed by Roman Catholics today, and if you look at it, it is very much more so a Roman Catholic document than it is a Lutheran document. Um, and so when he writes that, he's at a very, very different starting place than he ends up, not only later in life, but even like in those early books of the three treatises of the Babylonian captivity. Goodness me, even of the Heidelberg Disputation, which is not old by any means, right? This is like 1 year difference. And yet the distinction is huge. You have another huge break at 1521 with the Diet of Worms. You have another huge break with I believe it's 1525 with the Bondage of the Will. And then you have, of course, an even bigger break with the Schwabach Articles, the Augsburg Confession, the Catechisms. All of that stuff is really like the meaty bit of the development of Luther's theology. And then, of course, you get into late Luther, and people start talking about, you know, his anger issues with the Jews. But his anger issues are not just for the Jews. They began long before, right? You pick up, for example, any of Luther's biblical commentaries. You could pick up his lectures on Genesis, his work on the Magnificat, his work on, oh my goodness, just anything. And actually, the Magnificat's pretty good. But a lot of his Bible commentaries are not actually about the scriptures that they're supposed to be about. They're about the Pope and how much he hates the Pope. And so, a lot of, but it's true, right? When we talk about late Luther, a lot of that conversation gets derailed by, um, the attitude of Luther far more than the ideas, the thought, the work of Luther. So, anyways, when he's embarking on this work with the 95 Theses, Hinlicky's stating like this is just the beginning, right? As he puts it, it's an opening skirmish to the larger war that's at hand, right? And so he begins with this issue of indulgences. He begins with these issues of purgatory. He begins with those kinds of issues that were presumed. Purgatory was presumed to exist. He doesn't challenge that in the 95 Theses. Indulgences are presumed to exist. He doesn't by any means challenge that in the 95 Theses. But moving forward from there on, right, he starts to notice that there is this issue, as he might put it. If it is true, for example, that the Pope has the power to, um, how does it put it? Because it's very distinct, right? So even in the 95 Theses, Luther's saying, like, these indulgences are not to remit the, is it the spiritual punishment for sin, something like that, like the actual spiritual reality of sin, or is it just the temporal consequences of these sins, right? But then he says, if the Pope can remit it, why does he not, out of grace and love, remit it? Give this kind of free pass to do so. What's this whole, let's call it a fetish even, for punishment, or as Hinlicky's saying, this punitive nature of not just purgatory, but of all of medieval Catholicism, right? It has this kind of obsession with punishing evil and engaging in retributive justice, right? Um, and as Luther's noticing already at this time, in that kind of schema, it's this idea that, well, in the midst of that punitive, retributive justice paradigm, everything is hinging not upon God and his act externally from us, but through the church, right? That it is the indulgences that you get through the church. It is the will of the arbitrary will seemingly of the Pope, which is giving you this alleviation, or however you might say that, of that kind of temporal consequence that needs to be um, poured out upon you. So then, as he's reflecting on those kinds of ideas and working through them, from the time of 1517 up until some of his, even like very soon after those kinds of works, he's already starting to realize that the greater problem here is not an abuse of indulgences. It's not a sort of arbitrariness to the alleviation of those temporal consequences of sin in purgatory. But the real problem, fundamentally, behind all of this is is at root that punitive retributive justice idea, especially as it is alleviated through the instrument of the church in a legal formula. Do you know what I mean by that? It's something like this, right? It's something like to say, in this legal formula, you have not rendered justice unto God, justice needs to be rendered. how that's formulated, I'm not super scholastic, so if I get any of the terms wrong, forgive me. Don't send me to purgatory or anything. But like if you don't do the right thing, then justice through punishment needs to be meted out so that the justice meter can be satisfied. If that makes sense to you, right? And so even in a proper formulation of that, which in the whole presupposition is incorrect, in my opinion. But like if you were going to say, well, justice needs to be meted out, it needs to be filled up, well, that's going to be filled up by the life and death of Jesus Christ, like the active and passive obedience of the righteousness of Jesus Christ in his life under the law, as well as also in his death, submitting in this great act of obedience to the will of the Father for the saving of all people, which is the most righteous and holy act that could ever be, right? And a lot of people forget that as well. Like actual righteousness is not seen in my not sinning, as much as it's seen in forgiving sin, right? It's not seen, for example, in the fact that Jesus never cheated on a woman, but it's seen most of all, greatest of all, in that he took the sin of the men who did cheat on their wives upon himself and died for it. Right. So the greatest righteousness that ever was is the death of Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of sinners, not actually abstaining from sin itself, right? It's not just this blank state of purity, but it's the taking of dirtiness upon himself for the sake of other people. Like you want to talk about the highest form of righteousness, well, it is, and the Bible says this too, but in a different kind of vocabulary. Not so much as in righteousness, though we can tack that on there, and I think we should, but in the sense of love. Right? There is no love greater than this. You know that Bible verse? That a man lay his life down for his friends. Well, actually, there is a greater love to lay your life down for your enemies, right? You know what I'm saying? Anyways, Luther realizes the whole presupposition is wrong. And then he goes into, 1518, Heidelberg Disputation. And he realizes, no, 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 it's not actually about the fulfilling of the law, but the gospel is actually about the forgiveness of sins, right? And this is where he gets to that whole law gospel distinction. The law says do this and it's never done. That meaning, and we've done some episodes on that as well, is that the law is always telling you do this, do that, do that. And not only is the list never ending, but the time lapse is never ending. You know what I mean? It's not like he's saying be perfect for 5 minutes, be perfect for 60 years. No, be perfect forever, right? It's not as though there's some kind of elapsing time limit when you're on the clock for rendering righteousness. It's eternal, right? And that list is never ending. And you've never exhausted it. And you've never fully done the right thing, never fully for long enough, right? But there's another thing that comes around, and that's the gospel. And the gospel doesn't say do this. It says believe this, right? Believe what? Believe not the and you have to connect the two to really get the understanding. It's implied. Let's paraphrase it a little better than it's often translated. The law says do this and it's never done, but the gospel says believe that it is already done. And where's that? In the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so even though you can pose this in a kind of righteousness, rendering satisfaction kind of paradigm, Luther is really taking all of that out of the conversation, and instead of that, he's putting in, well, this new word of preaching. And preaching what? The work of Jesus Christ in life and in death. And then you also have, I think it's Article 28 of the Heidelberg Disputation. I think that one is 27 or 26. And then in 28, he says God does not find, but creates that which is pleasing to him, right? So a lot of this stuff is about, well, I'm going to merit justification, or I'm going to merit righteousness. I'm going to give to God what he rightly deserves. But rather, in the Heidelberg Disputation, Article 28, it's not so much about us giving God what he needs, so much as him giving us what we need and that which pleases him. And so, you can apply this to the conversation of salvation as well. And this is why I always say, like, that whole thing about people get really mad at me for this, by the way. That whole thing about the justification issue and the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification, which a lot of people really hate that I talk about. But like, and they say, well, the doctrine of justification is the article on which the church stands or falls. Absolutely, I agree. However, as to whether works are necessary or not is a red herring because when we talk about justification by faith alone, faith is also not something that we do, right? And then we say, well, you can't say any works are part of it. Well, sorry, works are also not something that you do. Both things are created by God in you, given to you by God for you. right? They're not like something, it's not like we say, oh, well, um, I can believe. No, first of all, you can't believe. That's Article 3 of the small catechism in the Apostles' Creed. I believe I cannot believe, right? But the Holy Spirit has enlightened me with his gifts, called me by the gospel, enlightened me with that, called me into the true faith, and kept me there in the church where he daily and richly forgives me all sins and the sins of all believers. Right? Now, those who say, well, I understand I can't believe, but I definitely, God's giving me the faith, but then, well, with the work stuff I do. No, that's absurd. You don't do the works, right? You could go to Philippians, I think it's 2:13. God is the one at work, giving us both the will and the works which please him, the will to do the things which please him, and actually working the works which please him in us, right? You could go to Colossians 1, where St. Paul's talking about how it's from the hope of the gospel preached to us that both faith and love, that is works, right, spring up from within us through the preaching of this gospel. You can go to James, where he begins in chapter 1 with this idea of the implanted word, that seed which then flowers, it blooms and blossoms within you into then what you see in chapter 2, right? People say, well, look, I have faith without works, and he says, show me your faith by your works, right? And it's not because faith is the cause of works, but rather the same cause of faith is the cause of those works, right? If we want to speak super accurately about it. And again, people are going to get mad at that and say, well, it's not what I read in that book. Sorry, right? However, all of this to say, Luther's going through a really kind of radical sort of change here. He's begun with this kind of idea of, well, it's not really good to just pay some money and get out of purgatory. Really, you should either go to purgatory and suffer, or you should suffer here in this life. You should actually do your purgation, that you owe, render that unto God. And then he's moved into this, well, really, true justice is merited by Christ. And really, now, our work is not so much handing out or selling indulgence letters, but it's really this idea of preaching the kerygma of Jesus Christ crucified, right? This is where he gets, Hinlicky's here in this section. He's writing all about this idea of the folly of the cross, the folly of the cross. Or you could also say, this is the scandal of the cross. How is it that sinners, and this is something people bring up to me all the time. How is it that you can say like the worst people who've done murders, who've done, you know, other kinds of crimes, which I won't mention, um, can just believe in Christ and get off scot-free? And I say, no, 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 you don't understand. It's not about getting off scot-free. It's about this whole idea that um, the wrath of God poured out on that sin. That sin's taken by Jesus Christ. And so we can't say, well, they're getting off scot-free or the sin has not been punished. No, the sin has been punished. Not by a jail sentence, which is far too little to actually suffice for um satisfying justice. It's not even by hell, which again is far too small for satisfying justice. It's the death of God, right? That's the only thing that can really, at the end of the day, that's the only thing that can really satisfy justice. And this is brought up all over in the Book of Concord, in the Augsburg Confession, and the Apology of the Augsburg Confession. This idea that we might have this stupid idea that our works, our whether they are our attempts at doing what God has instituted that we do, or our own inventions of what we think we should do, um, that could ever compete, even just a little bit, with the life, death, and resurrection of God for us. So it's insane and it's absurd, right? And so now Luther is coming to this whole idea of, well, now we're focusing on the law gospel distinction. Now we're focusing on this idea of the theology of the cross. Now we're focusing, and by the way, if you want a great book on the theology of the cross and the Heidelberg Disputation, I would always recommend Gerhard Furdy's, being a theologian of the cross. And that is a really, in my opinion, that's a beautiful little book, which really gets at, I think, the root, the kind of core, the seed of the idea of, well, what is Luther trying to get across in all of these terms of God creating, which pleases him, not looking for it, of God, doing something different in the gospel than he was doing in the law, of the idea of a theologian of the cross saying something like it is, rather than, doing what the theologians of glory do and the theologians of the law do, right? So now, when he's coming up with this new change. And by coming up, I don't mean, inventing. I mean, he's beginning to kind of work with it in this new way. Luther is coming to the conversation with a different purpose in mind. Before, and I suppose say it this way, before this, with that whole presumption of the need to render our justification, our righteousness unto God, it's kind of like he needs something from us. And so the task of the theologian or the pastor, the priest, the writer, whatever, is to figure out what it is God needs from us, and then telling people this is what you need to do for God, right? It's about coming to the conversation with a list well, yeah, a list of do's and don'ts, of what God needs, what we need to do for him and to him. But after this change with the Heidelberg Disputation, it's not about what God needs, but about what God gives, not what we need to give for him, what he has done for us. And so the conversation goes from an instruction, an exhortation, toward not an explanation, but a preaching, a giving, a communication, if you will, of the work of God in Jesus Christ. Then he moves on, Hinlicky, that is, and he starts to talk about Luther's move then with, if that's true, then what's the impact on how we live our lives and on, how we love, how we engage in good works? Like if all of this is not about rendering justification and righteousness to God, well, then what's it for? And, there is a kind of tempting, um, I'll just say a temptation to move toward what's called a moral influence theory of the atonement to say, well, Jesus gave his life for sinners, and there we see this aspect of what we should do, and part of that's true. But the rest of moral influence theory is, that is what the cross was for. It was to tell you what kind of righteousness God really wants. And part of that's true. Part of that is God didn't want your poor attempts at being a decent person. He wanted the full forgiveness of sins through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's true. It's also true that we can say, well, God, if he's saying, well, what should you do? He's not saying you should abstain from drinking too much, but actually should go and serve your neighbor. That's true as well. And so he's taking that idea, those kinds of partial correctnesses of these things that are only partially true, right? He's taking the true parts of those, taking the meat and spitting out the bones. And he's saying, well, okay, now we need to go and love our neighbor freely for their sake, not for our own sake to be saved, not for God's sake, as though he's some kind of thing we feed with our good actions for other people, but that we're actually going to live in love for our neighbor. And this is when he's saying, this is true love alive in the world, where that freeness, that voluntariness, where the human being is not bound by law to go and do something for other people, but that he does it freely for the sake of the other people in love. Well, that's what we're really, 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 really talking about. And so he's saying, well, this is really like, if you want to talk about the love of the cross, the act of the cross alive in the people of the church, the cruciform church, well, you're looking at free voluntary works for other people for their sake. It's not about this kind of, well, we're going to do these works so that we don't lose our salvation or so that we merit salvation, but it's saying, how can I live in salvation and be a sign of this salvation to other people as I live and breathe and do things in the world? And I'm just going to quote Hinlicky here because I think he phrases this really, really, really well, right? He says, and this is about love. This is a large quote, by the way. Luther's caustic analysis, however, this merely natural law amounts only to the religious climber's realization that piety pays. A healthy dose of spirituality is in one's enlightened self-interest, right? And so what he's talking about here is this idea of the ladder to God. If you want another kind of book recommendation on this idea, it'd be for Gerhard Furdy's Where God Meets Man. A really good introduction to the idea of a God coming to meet us where we are rather than encouraging us to climb up to him, like this idea of the ladder unto godliness or unto salvation. He says he names this naturally elicited love of God concupiscent love. That is selfish, greedy love that loves God not for God's sake, but for one's own sake. That is, that they might be saved, rather than because he's the one who saved them. One loves God poisonously when one love seeks for interest, itself to gain reward and avoid pain. as coded in the usual theologies of heaven, hell, and purgatory. So all of that, legal paradigm of, well, God is looking for a reason to send you to hell unless you do something for him, right? This is not actually a theology of love, not a theology of God loving man, not a theology of man loving God. It's a theology of fear and threat and obedience to escape danger, right? And so he says Luther formulates his theology of the cross to target exactly such greedy love of God because in its self-deception, it confuses everything, calling good evil and evil good. And that's where Luther comes to, the whole reason for his statement in the Heidelberg Disputation about um, a theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is, right? Not mixing it up, not saying, well, the gospel is love your neighbor as yourself, or the law of God is you must believe, right? Getting these accurate things, not calling good evil and evil good, but calling a thing actually what it is in reality. He says, but the good of the cross, surprisingly, is that it spiritually crucifies the natural selfish lover of God apart from this death of the sublime sinner. The creative divine agape love cannot actually find the bad and needy person hidden behind the gleam and glitter of religious works upon which to lavish its new divine creative flood of agape love. Note well, Luther's polemic is not directed against good works, but the religious works invented by spiritual seekers to placate or impress the deity. And so what he's talking about here is we in this paradigm of the law, this legal understanding, this worldview of the law, where the gospel is the handmaid, the slave of the law, right? That it's all just, well, Christ rendering the law for the law's sake, and us doing the law for the law's sake, and all of this about what we need to do and what God demands that we do, is that there is no real doing of things for goodness sake or for love's sake or for other people's sake, and thus there's no love. But rather, it's all for self-interest. Agreed. It's as Augustine would say, incurvatus in se. It's curved in on itself. This is selfishness exemplified. He says, what is at issue then is what makes truly good works good. Luther's answer will be Christologically shaped, and I'll just add cruciform, right? What is at issue here is the definition of good itself. So he says a truly good work comes about when the Christian believer loves the neighbor in the world, just as Christ has come into the world and made a neighbor of the believer. Right? Well, how is that? Well, voluntarily, not under threat, not because he needed to, not for selfish self-interest or gain. And here I'm gonna Hinlicky doesn't do. I'm gonna drag the Calvinists and the evangelicals in here and say there's a serious theology of glory problem there, because if you read their books, you read the Reformed literature, the evangelical literature, all of it is about God doing everything, including saving you, just to glorify himself. So the end of it, and they say, well, it's good because the end of it is God, and that's how you should do theology. You know, well, no. And we can acknowledge that they're saying, well, this is taking place within the triune Godhead, and so it's Father trying to glorify the Son, and the Son trying to glorify, and yeah, we get that. However, you do not have a God loving man situation, right? You have a God turning man into a pawn to glorify other persons of the Trinity situation, right? And so it uses people not as the end, but as the means for glorifying God. And so you do not have a God loving people theology. And a God not loving people theology is not a theology of the cross, because as the words of God in the Holy Scriptures state of the cross, there is seen there God loving men, right? He has shown his love for us here in that Jesus Christ died for us while we were yet sinners. Now, it doesn't say we see God's love for God here, right? And that is partially true. You do, but that's not the entirety of the truth revealed to us. Actually, the emphasis is on God loving man in and through the cross, not on God loving God through the cross. Although, of course, you cannot have one without the other. There is this kind of correlative aspect. When we love people, we are loving God, especially as we see God in them. And you'll see if you read, Bonhoeffer, if you read um, Moltmann, you'll see that for sure. You will. That you need to see, and you'll see this also in the medievals, Saint Francis. You'll see this in Saint John Chrysostom. The idea of seeing God in poor people that we love. That's true, and God seeing them there as well. And this has to do with the image and likeness and so on, so on, so on. But again, the emphasis, the point, the trajectory, the essence of the thing is on God loving man. So, and we move on. This connects really well to Luther's work on the freedom of the Christian. And so again, his theology starts to kind of hit the ground running and take up speed and bolster itself, get more courageous, more strong in its assertions and its confidence that it's correct and on the right track here. So now Luther's writing in Freedom of the Christian on this whole idea of love, in that it's set free. And that's why the book is called Freedom of the Christian. But what does he mean? Well, freedom to love others. And this is the only way you can have love, right? So like, for example, I had catechism kids ask me the question on Sunday, why did God not just force everybody to behave? You know, well, the classic answer is because that's not love. Like coercion, like love does not exist within coercion. Love does not exist within threat of obedience, but it can only be done freely and voluntary for the sake of the other. So that he says, right, um, um, the meaning of this paradox of, oh, hold on, my son is asking for food. Okay, so as I was saying, in this work of the freedom of the Christian, what Luther's really trying to get at, and what he's successfully getting at, is that idea connected with, a lot of people will say, freedom of the Christian is all about how we're saved by grace and can do whatever we want. No, freedom of the Christian is about love, rightly defined, um, and seen there in faith, like in the gospel. So let me just quote Hinlicky here. He says, and he's working on something about Paul working on that idea of Christ having set us free for freedom, and he did it through his life, death, and resurrection, and then received in faith and the gospel and all that stuff. So he says here, right? Um, the the belief that Luther or St. Paul before him is abolishing the idea of good works, which is an accusation that they both received, is, he says, false. And correctly, he says that, right? In dispute, what they're actually doing, right, is defining good properly and putting forth good works as truly good works. So he said, well, what does that mean? Well, he says, Hinlicky says, truly good work is revealed in the life culminating in death on the cross of Jesus Christ, who became a slave to set others free, right? So this is all the things that we've been saying thus far. It is love is truly, properly seen. Goodness, righteousness is seen mostly in the cross of Jesus Christ, dying for the sake of those who sinned against him, more than it is from your abstaining from unclean things. It's taking the dirtiness of the unclean thing upon yourself that they might be then cleansed and redeemed. That's where love is really seen. And he says then when we emulate that, when we live into that in our own lives, what we're doing is participating in that one good work of Jesus Christ, right? Which is why Jesus Christ and his church are connected. St. Paul then calls us the mystical body of Jesus Christ. And so then he's talking about us going and loving our neighbors. And what that means is us going and being Christ to our neighbors, as Luther has spoken of that, right? And so what we're receiving then in faith alone, just to use, that jargony term, when we receive the gospel of faith, what we are doing is receiving the free love freely given of Jesus Christ into ourselves and for ourselves. And then when we then actively participate in that gospeliness toward others, right? We are, how does he put it? Participating by faith, working in love, which is something that St. Paul also says, right? So he says then, well, what this is all about, just to quote Hinlicky again, the point is to make unmistakably clear that not only Christ delivers from the holy predicament of divine and holy judgment upon the self-deceived servant of sin, it is important here not to take the term law as denoting something like ethics in our contemporary usage. Ethically, there is no difference between law and gospel. Both have their content the instruction to love of God above all and love of one's neighbor as oneself, as both self and other creatures are in and under creative love of God. It is crucially important not to take the term law philosophically as ethically or as juridicially as civic laws, so on, so on, so on. So, this is a point that David Scare also makes. and I forget the book that he makes it. I guess it's just Law and Gospel. um, in that Confessional Lutheran Dogmatic series, where there, Dr. Scare is saying, in when we're talking about the distinction between law and gospel, we're not talking necessarily about a separation. Both things act upon the sinner. Both things exist within the Christian, and both things come into perfect unity and union in Jesus Christ, in whom the law is fulfilled, and by his fulfilling of that law and satisfying of that law, the gospel is then conceived and freely given to sinners, right? And so it's also, we can apply also some other terms here which might stretch that definition and push against it, like Jesus' own. I think it's Matthew 9. Is it Matthew? Yeah, I was just going through it in the Greek. I forget. Yeah, I think it's Matthew 9 with the old patches and the no, the is the old garment, new patches, and old wineskins and new wine. They don't mix because if you put the new patch on the old garment, these how does it work? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's the. Yeah, no, I think that's right. The clothing will stretch and it will tear a greater rip in the cloth. With the new wine in the old wineskins, that wineskin has already been stretched to its max. And when that new wine starts to ferment in there, it's going to stretch it more and the wineskin will burst. In the same kind of way, when we try to take that full ever greater yet still righteousness of Jesus Christ that we see on the cross in his freely giving of himself unto death for sinners into the law, it bursts the law asunder, right? And so, we can speak of this in those two kinds of ways. One in which, they are coming to a head in Jesus Christ, but also one where the law is broken apart by that gospel of Jesus Christ in a way that it can't really be put back together. And so, all of this is coming back down to this question of how do we live then? Do we live in the law? And this is where it gets really kind of tricky because um, people would like to say, and this gets to that whole third use of the law stuff. And I've said before, I would really prefer that we say third use of the gospel sometimes. And this is why, right? Because they would like to say, we realize we cannot fulfill the law, so then we receive the gospel, and then that sets us free to go and live back under the law again. Well, that's not how this is supposed to work. It's not the idea that the gospel exists for the law, but rather I forget which. I think it's Edmund Schlink. He says the law exists for the gospel, not the gospel for the law, right? And so that whole idea is, well, how then are we to live being set free? And this comes back to that idea of the freedom of a Christian. Well, it sets you free. You're a slave to no man, and you're a slave to all freely, right? So that idea is you are not doing things out of threat for your neighbor, but freely. And so you're actually not only living in the gospel, you are manifesting and manifestly becoming examples of that gospel toward other people. So that when you then live freely for others in a sacrificial, cruciform, crucified sort of way, crucifying kind of way, living lives of the cross, which bear forth the cross, which show forth the cross, which proclaim the cross, which embody the cross, all of that stuff is to, in a sense, do the gospel. My predecessor here at this congregation used to say something, and I really don't think he meant the same thing by it, but he used to say, you should live the gospel. This, I don't know what he meant by that, but if what he meant by that was what I'm saying now, absolutely, right? Live in a way that mimics and imitates the complete love of Jesus Christ, the love that is ever yet greater still than anything ever else could ever be, right? That love of I'm going to obliterate myself for your sake. People talk to me all the time about forgiveness, and they say, this whole idea of forgiveness, it's really too much. You're encouraging people to tolerate sin and wickedness done against them and to not retaliate. That's literally what Jesus said, right? If one hits you on one side, turn to them the other also. And they'll try and make up these, explanations of what that means to say it doesn't mean what it says. That's what he said. If someone, forces you to go with them 1 mile, go with them two. If someone takes your is it your tunic, give them your cloak, or your cloak, give them your tunic, whichever way that goes, right? Um, if one begs from you, always give it to them. If they try to steal from you, give them gifts, right? Love you. You've heard it, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say love your enemy as well. Feed those. How does it go? feed those, however, right? Love those who hate you, do good to those who persecute you. And so that idea, all of that, is stuff we see not commanded in the law, but shown forth to us by Jesus Christ on the cross. So then, so then, moving on from this, where he's still talking, and like he's still talking about the freedom of the Christian, but then he moves on from this idea of works and love of us toward others, and he goes really deeply into this idea of the gospel. And there's only like maybe three more movements in this chapter. We've got this idea of, the great exchange, the gospel, as we might understand it, this whole faith alone thing. And then he talks a little bit about, moving from there into really kind of something philosophical. And then he moves on to the Holy Eucharist and the body, the flesh of Christ given and shed, bloodshed for us to eat and drink in the Holy Eucharist. Oh, he says here, right? This idea of, what is that gospel that we believe? He says this, going back to that idea of justice, the rendering one what he deserves, that being the idea of righteousness. He says, this is really perfectly done. Not e And this goes back to, first of all, in one sense, that's not at all the point, and we already talked about that. In another sense, and this is why, with all of these things, you can and cannot do it. And some people really hate when I say that. I was asked a question in the TTM, the Transcendent Truth Discord, a while ago. And it was, I swear it was about justification. It was, and they said, do we maintain or not maintain? Can it be lost or can it not be lost? And I said, yes, and also no. And it can be maintained and it can also not, in the sense that um, God is the one who wholly completely does it. And yet at the same time, he does it through word and sacrament. So in cutting yourself off from word and sacrament, which are the means by which he does it, yes, you can um, lose it, but no one loses it, right? They throw it away or they reject it. So it's this, yes and no kind of thing. People get really mad when I do that stuff, but it's true here too, right? And so Hinlicky's saying here, um, about Luther's theology of the gospel. He says the essence of justice is really precisely what the sinner's faith does in glorifying God for his grace. That's how he words this here. That's a direct quote. So he moves on he then talks about the gospel itself that faith believes. He says another argument is that faith is the bridal pledge of the soul in response to the bridegroom's nuptial vow, I am yours and you are mine. In this case, faith is that which honors the justice or righteousness of Christ in his remarkable gift of himself in joyful exchange. However, you have to remember, and maybe that was confusing for you, so I'll explain. He's saying faith is, well, let me phrase it in my own words, the receiving of the gift, right? To each his due. Well, here's the really interesting thing. I am due nothing from Jesus Christ. I am owed nothing from the Lord God. All I have done is sin against the Lord God and against Jesus Christ very specifically, right? However, um, he gave me a gift anyway, not because it was my due, not because he owed it to me. So there's no justice rendered in that sense to me, right? This is a crazy thing. However, and that's why I say, but true justice is well, true righteousness is not just. You know what I'm saying? People say, well, that's not right. Yeah, true, it's not. It's not just. Nothing's due to me, nothing's owed to me. And yet, as Luther's saying, as Hinlicky's saying about what Luther's saying, is when I have faith, when I receive that gift from him. So if someone gives you a gift and you receive it, well, now you are honoring their gift toward you. You are giving them their due. And so he's saying faith is the rendering of righteousness, the rendering of justice to the gift giver, right? To the gift giver. And this comes back down to, you have to understand, all of that's taking place in this schema of an abandonment of the idea of justice in that sense altogether, right? Like this is about a free gift freely given, not actually about things owed, things due, things rendered, right? And so faith, if we want to say, well, it's the rendering of justice unto the gift giver, well, the fact that he's a gift giver is showing us that God is moving far beyond the scope of the limits within justice, within what's due, what's owed, what's earned, what's deserved. He's moving far beyond that into the realm of grace and scandal and, well, Romans 4 ideas. God is the one who justifies, makes righteous the ungodly, right? Who forgives the sinner. All of that stuff. It's not, I don't want to say radically new, but it's radically new in a non-heretical way in the sense that, well, it was always there, right? Um, but it's very different from that medieval understanding of how God relates to men, how men relate to God. And so, um, picking up on this, then we begin to talk about, well, we have this unmerited, undeserved free gift. And then at the same time, talking about, well, faith really is the truest form of rendering justice. And yet, what it's rendering justice to is an abandonment of care for one's own justice being received. In the sense, not one's own justice in what he's doing to those he owes things to, but in the fact that he's abandoned that scheme to care for things that are owed, things that are due, things that are deserved, things that are merited and operating rather in that realm of grace and forgiveness and unmerited favor, right? So, um, then he's talking about, well, this whole idea of justification in Luther's thought here, um, comes down to not, and this goes back to that yeah, I guess we can call it a Reformation dispute, but because this is taking place, like it's the idea of the book is, well, it's taking place in the contemporary scene when this is really happening. So that conversation, let's call it, that's a good way to put it. That conversation that Luther was having with those around him was, is grace infused or is grace imparted? And again, this is also something that was talked about in the Transcendent Truth Discord server, and you should join us there sometime. The links are in some of the videos descriptions, not all of them. Sometimes I get lazy. Actually, a lot of the times I get lazy, but. Yeah, is grace this motivating factor to goodness, and then is justification, this idea of God calling us righteous because we ourselves are righteous. And then what is justification? Like what is righteousness? Well, really, it is not. It is not. Well, this is a very long, complex discussion, and it's not really Hinlicky's point, but because it was brought up in the Discord server. There's a big argument about it, but um. It is that final verdict that you have actually met the standard of the law and done the justice. You've done the justice. This is something you can see actually really interestingly if you pick up a copy of the New American Bible, not the NASB, but the NABRE from the Roman Catholic Church, and the UC, what's the acronym? The USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops produced it, and all of the places where you know Protestant Bibles will say, really, that's just every translation other than the NIVRE. They'll say righteousness or they'll say justification, but the NABRE will say justice in that philosophical, like that really medieval kind of philosophical sense of a thing due, a thing owed, a thing rendered, a thing given. And so when Luther was in conversation with that, he was saying, well, going back to those ideas in the Heidelberg Disputation, that's not really how this works, right? Because God's not actually looking and finding, he's actually creating. And so this justification is not him saying, yes, after this infused grace has really motivated you toward the doing of the good. And different theologians will phrase that differently. That's just my take. That's just my phraseology on that Roman Catholic idea is God is then looking at the final product and saying, now you are finally righteous. Whereas Luther's saying he's placing this declaration of righteousness, not because you are the thing, but because Christ has freely given you that thing and he's clothed you in that. And so, a fancy phrase for this, which is often used, is forensic justification. Now, of this, Hinlicky says, there is valid concerns about this, right? That it lacks transformation, although it really doesn't, because the transformation in Luther's thought and later Lutherans is that transformation, which the Augsburg Confession calls new obedience, comes from, some would say from faith. Others will say, well, from the grace given in word and sacrament. Some will say, but we can always say it comes from that righteousness that is not just clothed upon us, but placed in us in Jesus Christ. And this is where that whole forensic justification versus an imparted or an infused becomes really difficult. I would recommend, for example, a book called Union with Christ, which is edited by Carl E. Broughton and Robert Jensen, which talk about Monerma's um, new Finnish interpretation uh, forgive me for saying this, in my opinion, a better way than Jordan Cooper does it, where you have the actual righteousness of God being God Himself, being Jesus Christ, taking up residence within you, and then yes, transforming you from within. And yet it is forensic in that it's still not you, and that it's still external toward you, but having an impact on you. And he says, from this valid concern arose the forensic doctrine of justification, which is the metaphor of God, the judge. Now you have to realize and note his term here, metaphor. There is no real kind of cosmic courtroom. It's a motif. And when we talk about penal substitutionary atonement or we talk about Christus Victor, all of these are motifs. And this is why you shouldn't say one is true over the other, because neither are absolutely true to the exclusion of the other. In the fact, neither of them are actually fully true in a real kind of sense, but they are metaphorical motifs that get at the inexhaustible, inexpressible truth of the atoning work of Jesus Christ. So he says, from these concerns then comes the idea, the doctrine of forensic justification, which is the metaphor of God, the judge, pronouncing the verdict of not guilty upon the guilty sinner. Now, notice those words, not guilty verdict upon the guilty sinner. But the communicant, concomitant subordination or even rejection of the motif of the joyful exchange comes at the severe cost of truncating the Christological backbone of Luther's theology of justification, in turn obscuring Luther's account of the transformation of the existing self in the gift of faith, which for Luther is the new birth from above by the Spirit and the actual good reason to speak of justifying faith. So what Hinlicky is here talking about, right? He's here talking about this well, and here I would have to say I'm not so sure that Hinlicky really should be talking about the joyful exchange as a motif rather than a reality. Whereas I would agree this idea of forensic justification, this idea of penal substitutionary atonement are motifs, they are metaphorical ideas, but the joyful exchange is it's actually in the scriptures posed as real. This is something that Stephen Paulson. I was going to call him Paul Stevenson for whatever reason. Well, Steve Paulson gets really right, hammering on Luther's idea, not idea, but and Luther just got it from Paul. Paul says, "He who knew no sin became sin for us," and he doesn't say, "He who knew no sin was counted as sin for us, or was counted as a sinner for us, or was punished in our place because he was counted as a sinner," which is something that John MacArthur does. But rather, he's saying that he actually took our sin on himself. He actually became a sinner for us. That doesn't mean he committed sin. It means he took sin on himself, and then we have our sin taken away. We are no longer sinners. We are righteous in and because of propter Christum, Jesus Christ. And oh, by the way, all those who say, "Oh, Paulson's a heretic because he said that," just look at the Luther quote he pulls from. It's just verbatim. Look at the St. Paul quote Luther pulls from. It's just verbatim, right? So he says then, this idea of justification um, being contrary to righteousness is faulty, and it's taking place within this whole kind of broader conversation about justice and where is justice actually found being meted out. And where is righteousness really found being performed, right? He says then, to be sure, when the justice of the justified sinner consists in the justifying of giving God glory for his undeserved, unmerited love toward us, this is my words now, then you see that sinner really engaging in justice in a far greater level than and this is Luther's point, this is the Book of Concord's point, right? Um, 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 what does God really want? Um, you not actually giving him what is due toward him, meaning your sins, like your failure to do the things he's instituted you to do in the law and the commands? No, I don't think so. Rather, what is more preferential is you actually giving him his due, which is faith. right? And yet, even still, the faith is not something that you give him, it's something he gives you, right? This is Romans 10:17. Where does faith come from? It comes from hearing of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Or you could go to John 6. Um, 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 where the people are saying, what is it that, what is it that we must do? What are the works of God that he would have us do? And Jesus says, the work of God, of course, this depends on your translation, but this is my advice on how you should translate it. This is the work of God that you believe. Right? Or you could go to Ephesians. Is it 1 or is it 2? St. Paul says, and faith is a gift. It's not our own doing. And so faith, just like, works too, are both things that God does and puts in us. This is going back to then to that idea of the Heidelberg Disputation. God does not find but creates that which is pleasing to him. So all of Luther's writings here, while there is a movement, while there is a transition, a progress that we are tracking, that we're kind of looking at, what we're seeing there is a cohesiveness to that movement of idea, right? Moving from, the 95 Theses and then into this Heidelberg Disputation and then into this, Freedom of a Christian and the broader work of the three treatises. So let's just, he talks a little bit more about this idea of justification, of union with the Holy Spirit, which is super important. And he does talk about how, when this doctrine of justification forensically and the sola fide stuff um, goes awry, it goes awry in the sense that it becomes really a legal fiction, where as the detractors are saying toward us that we have proclaimed ourselves righteous and that we are still terrible, awful sinners. Well, that's not very good, right? But we have to understand, as he's saying, and as you might find, for example, in that book I recommended, Union with Christ, edited by Broughton and Jensen, that idea of the justification placed upon us causes that transformation, and it causes the transformation, and it is actually brought upon us because of Christ in us. This goes to, for example, Galatians 2:20. Now Christ lives in me, not no, sorry, not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And you could go to Galatians 3:27. Those who are baptized have been clothed with Christ. You could go to Romans 6. Baptism buries us into Christ. So baptism has this uniting power. And this is the kind of direction that Hinlicky takes this same idea, just as I'm doing here. He says Luther quite deliberately sustained the supplementation of the forensic interpretation of justification by faith with the equally biblical metaphor of the marriage of Christ with the believing soul, often abbreviated to union with Christ. Now, again, while I agree, just to reiterate, with what Hinlick is saying of justification forensically and penal substitutionary atonement motifs being metaphors and motifs and ideas getting at inexhaustible, inexpressible truth, not necessarily ontological realities. Union with Christ actually is one, right? In my opinion, at least. And so, and nevertheless, he's saying, indeed, Luther's rich view of the vital roles that Christ and the Spirit respectively play in justification arguably become far more visible in this account, which might be called effective justification. This is key. Effective meaning it's changing something, right? Since in this account of the transformation of the existing self into the new person of faith by Spirit-wrought union with Christ cannot be overlooked. It's rather the engine that powers the machine. As Luther imagines it, what happens in preaching or the sacraments not a sheer announcement of abstract grace, but a mediated communication of concrete grace, the crucified and risen Christ in person, this concrete mediator who is really present in the world, through word and sacrament, comes as a suitor wishing nuptials to give himself to you. Now, let me just say, what's happening here in my mind, because I believe that this is real, right? Not just a metaphor, not just a motif. It's not an idea. It's something happening. Is that in word and sacrament, Christ actually incarnates himself. In a sense, not becoming incarnate again. I'm not doing any heresies. Don't worry, right? But he sacramentally, incarnationally enters into us. Right? That when God says you're righteous, he's speaking about Christ in you, not speaking of the idea of Christ in you or the merits of Christ upon you, apart from Christ. As Melanchthon says, you only know the benefits of Christ, his merit, his righteousness, his justice, his glory, his holiness. Um, Sorry, you only know Christ by his benefits, but you, through those benefits, not only know him, you have him. You can't separate Christ. This is Melanchthon's point. You can't separate Christ from the benefits of Christ, right? The benefits of Christ come from and in and are had through Christ. And so all of this stuff is taking place in that idea of union and the idea of Christ in you and you in Christ, which are baptismal motifs and ideas. So he says then, this spirit raw obedience of faith, that new transformation, that new obedience, that new self emerges. And this, we don't have to just look at Hinlicky for this idea. We don't just have to look at Luther's broader works for this idea. We don't have to look at freedom of the Christian for this idea, although you can, and although we are doing that, right? But a great example here is taken just from that last question and answer in the Small Catechism. What does such baptizing with water indicate? Well, it indicates, it shows, it proclaims that a new man, not just the death of the old Adam, but the new man should arise in us daily and come forth to live before God in all righteousness and purity forever. So it's this not just I'm going to daily cyclically try and do my best today. It's I am looking towards some new kind of transformation, some new kind of reality to walk and live in. Whether we, and here's a good thing too, and this is something Pastor Roland has written about. I don't know if it's up on the Transcendent Truth blog thing, but he wrote a really good piece about how did he phrase it? About whether whether the Christian life, I forget how he posed it, whether it was the Christian life or the doctrine of sanctification, whatever, this idea of new obedience, whether it's about trying to um, progress progressively, transform progressively, or live into that binary reality. The example I like to live is of a light switch. You can live in the darkness or you can live in the light. You can live in the reality of who God has said that you are, or you can live hiding from that kind of reality. But it is a binary rather than a progress. However, if you want to say progress, that's fine. I'll leave you to it. So then Hinlicky starts talking all about these ideas of the divine and the human natures, and he starts talking about the philosophical underpinnings of the idea of Jesus Christ being both God and man at one, and how this relates to the union of Christ and the sinner. He talks a little bit here as well about pietism. He says, we shall discuss pietism in relation to this later on, and we're going to get to that in I believe it's the chapter that's actually on orthodoxy and confessionalism, because it was a what's the term, reaction against that. And he talks a lot about also kind of Christological heresies. He talks about Nestorianism. All of that would take really long, and it's really not that, it doesn't take up that much of the ink from his pen. So we're going to move on then. The last piece that he talks about here is he talks about Luther's work on "This is my body" and the confession concerning Christ's supper. And there, of course, well, what's he talking about there? Oh, I wonder, right? It's about the doctrine of the Holy Eucharist. So he talks about, and this is coming right off of that philosophical stuff of the two natures in Christ, what that means, the Nestorian heresy, and then he comes to a head of, well, what does all that mean? Well, it comes back to that earlier idea, and this is just, my take on this. Um, this is coming back to the idea of God giving himself to us in Jesus Christ, right? It's all being wrapped up together. So how can I phrase this in a summary sort of way, a summative sort of way, is, we begin by looking at the Heidelberg Disputation. Well, really, with the 95 Theses. Well, really, even go to my starting point. I think it's better, maybe even, to start before the 95 Theses, before 1517, before the Reformation really kicks off, when Luther is still presupposing this legal paradigm of justice needs to be rendered unto God. God's a heavenly chia pet in the sky that I need to feed him my righteous works and so on. Um, And then he realizes, no, that's not true. Actually, this is all about love, which is so much greater than what the law's demanding, where God is giving his whole self for us, for those who hate him, right? There's no greater love than this idea, that all of that's taking place in that scope of free gift and love and grace. And then, talking about um, the freedom of the Christian and what that means for us taking up that mantle of love, if I can say it that way without sounding charismatic or weird. Um, and then about this philosophical idea of the natures of Christ, of the two natures in the hypostatic union, beautiful stuff, right? But then well, where were we going with it? We're going, goodness me, to him giving us his flesh and blood. The same flesh and blood given and shed for us on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins. The same flesh and blood, which is the ground of grace. The same flesh and blood, which is the means by which God does that greatest act of righteousness and love that ever was. And he actually gives it to us in the Holy Supper. And so, we're talking about the union of Christ with the sinner, and we're saying, well, metaphorical. It sounds so abstract. It's such an idea. No, it's actually like a tangible thing in the sacrament of not just the Eucharist, but baptism too, and confession and absolution, right? These are the ways that Christ really makes himself present in the world, really gives himself to us in a way that we don't just hear it, we don't just think about it as in the sermon, which is sacramental too. Um, but in his actual flesh and blood, and not in a motif way, not in a metaphorical way, but in a this is actually real kind of way. And so yeah, all that, wrapping all of that up, right? He says here, going back to some philosophical stuff, he's saying, um, just as the human body and soul of Jesus does not cease to be human when it's appropriated in the incarnation by the divine person of the Son of God, so the loaf of bread does not cease to be truly bread when it's appropriated by the crucified and risen Christ as the vehicle of his promised grace. Given the unity of the person, however, Christ's genuine presence can only be the very body and blood and soul of our human brother that the divine Son once became and forever now remains. And so what's he talking about? He's talking about um, using these things to bring union into the world, not to, and this is why I say, the whole transformation idea of the sinner is maybe, I'm not going to say you can't do it, but when we talk about well, should we view sanctification and new obedience as a transformation and a progress rather than a union, rather than a binary living into? Well, probably I'm going to go with the latter. And the reason I'm going to do that is, just as the human and divine come into one person and remain what they were, so also the bread and Christ come into sacramental union and remain what they were in union. However, there is an interesting thing of the fact that we are not actually what we are supposed to be. So the bread is what it's supposed to be. This goes back to, you can say justice again, right? Um, what not only what do I owe to God? What do I owe to God in that I am myself? What do I owe to my humanness? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to be? Well, I'm not what I'm supposed to be, and I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. And so there is a sense in which all Christians believe there is coming a day when we will be something else, when that union that we have with Christ through bread and wine will not be through bread and wine anymore, but we'll see him face to face. And in a sense, that's what we already have in the sense that I am in him and he is in me by baptism, right? And I don't need a medium tangibly to get there anymore after that fact, if you will. Um, and yet there remains a kind of sense we can talk about beatific vision, a change of the fact that, we still have mediums to hear his voice. That's not going to exist anymore. There's coming a day when we will no longer need faith anymore, but we'll see by sight. These are Pauline ideas, apocalyptic ideas of, you know, what's coming, what's changing, what's happening, what's God doing, what's the new thing that's taking place. So, very long, very fun. Chapter one. God bless you. And next time we'll look at chapter two, Lord willing, on confession and orthodoxy, or confessionalism and orthodoxy. Take care. God bless you.